we want to take a look at the person named Jonah. Jonah is someone that most people who are familiar with the Bible would recognize as being someone significant in the Bible. They probably know the story of Jonah and the whale. Most kids would probably know that story. I want to share something that happened this past week at school. I work as an educational assistant for those of you who may not know, and I work with a lot of teachers and staff who, during this time where in this COVID pandemic, a lot of fear, a lot of apprehension about the future is in their hearts, and I've had a lot of chances to talk to different people about what's going on. They know obviously that I'm a pastor, and so there's one person in particular lately I've been working in their classroom, and this past week I've asked our Bible study group to be praying for me as I work in the auto body area, and the teacher I work with, and I'm just this past week as he's going through all of this and some personal issues, I just had the maybe that inclination from God's Spirit to just to ask him. I really I prayed, God, give me boldness, and I said to them, can I be praying for you and for your mother? He's concerned about his mom in a care home, and I think I kind of startled him, and he said, yeah, well, yeah, sure. And just being a witness for Christ in a world right now that it finds itself in a very confused place, a very dark place, a very hopeless kind of place in our world, wondering what's going to happen. He's concerned about his mother dying and all these things, and I just brought some comfort to him. And we are in a world where we have a chance to make a difference. And the prophet Jonah also had that opportunity, and God gave him a job to do, and we're going to see that job. You probably maybe know what that's going to be. But Jonah was somewhat of a reluctant prophet. He really didn't want to go and do what God was asking, and we'll see why. So let's look at the story of Jonah, not the whole story. We're going to kind of look at parts of it and how we can apply it to our lives here in the 2020 year, the very kind of interesting year we find ourselves in. But I really think this story is not so much about Jonah. This story is really about God, about how gracious and merciful God is, how concerned he is for the world around and for those who do not know him yet. And so we're going to see that. We're going to see this is really a story about God's heart. We call ourselves on our bulletin a church of second chances. We are a church who believes in grace, that God gives grace. And no matter how far you think you are from God and how many mistakes you've made, though you might think you are far beyond being saved or coming back to God, that's not true. God is a God of complete second chances. And second chance is used in the sense that it means you can return, you can repent, you can come back. God has always got his arms open, ready to forgive, ready to receive, if we would just turn to him. And so that's the message of this as well. And that's what we as a church believe. There's always a chance, as long as you are alive in this world, to return to God from where you are. What about Jonah? I mean, Jonah and the whale. Like, seriously, Dave? You're going to preach on Jonah and the whale on a Sunday morning? Well, I want to tell you what Jesus thought of Jonah. Because just like he believed in a real Noah and a real ark, he believed in a real Adam and Eve and creation, he also believed in a literal Jonah and a literal fish and a literal turning of heart in the hearts of Nineveh, the people of Nineveh. Matthew chapter 12 says, and Jesus is saying this, for just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, so will the Son of Man be. And then verse 41 of chapter 12, he says, the men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation. He's talking about the Pharisees and the scribes that he's talking to, the generation Jesus was in. He says they're going to rise up at the judgment with this generation, and they're going to condemn it. For they repented, they turned to God at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here, and he was talking about himself. He said if they would repent and turn to God based on a prophet's words, why aren't you turning to God based on the fact that the Son of God is here? Let's look at Jonah. Let's see what we can take for our lives. Jonah chapter 1. The very first verse of chapter 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah. I mean, he's a prophet. So God speaks to him. God speaks into his mind, his heart. And he says to Jonah, I want you to go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, for its wickedness has come up before me. Its wickedness has come up before me. When we think about God and we think about sin in this world, we realize how slow to anger God is and how He doesn't deal with our sin right away. He shows great patience and He waits for people to turn to Him. But there's a point. There's a point where sin has gone too far. There's a point where society has gone too far. And for Nineveh, they had reached that point. The wickedness had piled up, so to speak. Almost the image of just piling up until it reached the very throne room of God. It said it was so great that it reached God Himself. I wonder sometimes how God sees our world, how He sees our society here in North America, how He sees as we live for ourselves, as in a general sense, our world is so self-seeking and so self-centered and so focused on money, so focused on sexual relationships and immoralities. And you wonder at what point is God going to say that's enough? And maybe God is already in some ways saying that. He's warning us. And maybe something like this COVID pandemic is the way God warns and says, I'm here. You need to turn. You need to repent of the way you're living. So God saw that Nineveh was at the point of going too far. And He sends Jonah to tell them this. Now, Jonah doesn't want to go to Nineveh. Nineveh would be in the capital of Assyria, is an enemy of Israel. At this point in 790 BC, Assyria has been sending little bandits and little groups of soldiers and kind of doing some guerrilla warfare and really kind of harassing Israel. It'll be in 722, well, it's 70 years from now, from this point, where Assyria will eventually overtake the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes. So there's not a love between these two nations at all. And when God says to Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh, I mean, he was not happy at all. In fact, he's so upset about this that he decides to go in the opposite direction of Nineveh. And we understand he wants to go to Tarshish, which is in modern day Spain. I mean, that's across the entire Mediterranean Sea, whereas Nineveh is in today modern day Iraq. The estimated population of Nineveh, again being the capital of Assyria, a great empire kind of rising. Estimated population at one point for Nineveh was about 600,000, about the same size as the city here in Winnipeg that we live in. It describes in this book, in Jonah, at the end it says that the population was around about 122,000 souls that God was concerned about. But it said it took about 3 days to walk through. It's a large area. It's a large city. It's a very civilized place, and at the same time very, very sinful, very wicked, probably very violent. It would be by 625 BC, about 100 years after overtaking Israel, that it would eventually be destroyed, 625 BC. So God would warn them through Jonah. Warn through the Jonah. But Jonah decides to run away. And you think, well, is Jonah just simply scared? Is he scared to go there? I mean, this is an enemy territory. There's a lot of people there. They're not going to like me. Is that why he didn't want to go? There may have been some of that, but we don't know for sure. What we do know is what he says in chapter 4, verse 2. He says to God, after he has finally gone, and after they turn to God, and God relents from destroying them, this is what Jonah says to God. Didn't I say before I left home that you would do this, Lord? That is why I ran away to Tarshish. I knew that you are a merciful and compassionate God, slow to get angry and filled with unfailing love. You are eager to turn back from destroying people. He's not giving God a hand here. He's not saying, good job, God, like that's amazing. He's complaining. He's so angry. He's so upset that God would actually show mercy to this people who had been continually harassing Israel, who is violent. And he said, you know, God, I know what you're like. I know that you're compassionate. I know you're slow to anger. I know you're merciful. I know you're filled with unfailing love. I wanted you to destroy this nation. And that's why he ran. That's why he went away. So Jonah gets on this ship with these sailors. He's heading to Spain, Tarshish. I guess he feels in some way he can escape God. At least, you know, he's a prophet of God. You would think he would know better. But maybe in some way, even as we think, if I just go over there, if I just get away physically from where I'm supposed to be, there's nothing really that God can do. I mean, I'm going to be far away. And in his mind, he's thinking this is his only solution, just to get far away from, as far as he can from where Nineveh is. But God, of course, has his purposes, his will, and he's going to reach out to this great city of Nineveh. So verse 4, as Jonah is on this ship, it says, Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. So we know the story. There's a crazy storm. God has sent this storm. This is not just, you know, unfortunate situation where Jonah finds himself in a storm. This is a storm that God has purposely created right at that point to stop Jonah, to make a situation where Jonah would have to, you know, stop. He could not get away. Of course, the crew is all upset. They understand this storm is like, this is a crazy storm, and they start to cry out to their gods. They start to think something's wrong here. So for some reason, the gods are upset. This is an unusually powerful storm, and they go down to get Jonah. They realize Jonah is in the bottom of the ship. He's sleeping. Like, are you serious, Jonah? And the captain says, "Get up, call out to your God. Maybe there's something he can do." And he comes on board up top, and they're trying to figure out what's going on, like who's responsible, who's upsetting the gods. And so they draw straws, and God uses that pagan ritual, that pagan kind of way of deciding what's going on. God uses that to show that the responsibility is on Jonah himself. And Jonah says, they say to Jonah, what should we do? What do we need to do? And Jonah, knowing that he's the reason for all this, basically says, you need to throw me into the sea, and God will stop this. And the sailors, I mean, obviously they're civilized people somewhat. I mean, they're rough sailors, but it says in verse 14, then they cry out to the Lord. They start to pray. I mean, they're the ones who are doing the praying to God at this point. Jonah isn't. They cry out to the Lord. They start to understand that whatever gods they had were nothing compared to this God, this Hebrew of Hebrews, as Jonah described him. The God who created the heavens, who made the sea and the dry land. The God who really is God is the one responsible. And they start to believe. And I truly believe they become believers here. And I would definitely think that we would see these people in heaven one day when we get there. It says they cried out to the Lord, Jonah's God. "O Lord," they plead, "don't make us die for this man's sin, and don't hold us responsible for his death. O Lord, you have sent the storm upon him for your own good reasons." I mean, their theology is incredible. They get it. They understand what's going on. I'm sure he explained the whole situation to them. And they realize this God is real. And here's God working in the hearts of people who are pagan, who believe in other little kind of gods and whatever. And Jonah hasn't been talking to them about God. He hasn't been trying to help them. And here in an Old Testament fashion, become believers, become saved. And it's just an amazing story. So Jonah is thrown into the water, of course. As he's thrown into the water becomes completely calm. Not much unlike what Jesus did, right? When he said, "Be still," to the waves. And the disciples looked at him and were terrified. It said, "Who is this? Who is this who calms the storm where the waves and the wind listen to him and do as he says?" And they were terrified. They were terrified of the sea, but when they saw what Jesus did, they were more terrified of who was in the boat with them. I'm sure the sailors, they pick up Jonah, throw him into the sea, and the storm stopped at once. The sailors were awestruck, it says. They were awestruck by the Lord's great power. They were blown away. They were in awe. They were worshiping in their hearts. They realized this God is real. It says, and they offered him a sacrifice and vowed to serve him. They gave him their lives. As much as they knew, they gave him their lives. And I'm sure they were changed forever. So now Jonah's sinking down into the great water. He's going down deep, 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 deep. He's probably thinking, I'm dying. I'm going to die now. But God still has his plan, doesn't he? And he arranged, verse 17 of chapter 1, the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah. The word for fish or great fish here, people often say Jonah and the whale. The word for whale is a different Hebrew word, than this word. So it could have just been a very large fish. It could have been like a whale shark kind of fish, something very large. It could have been a whale, I guess, too, but the word is different. But whatever it is a very, very large animal, creature in the water that can swallow Jonah, and where he is not crushed right away, but he is inside. I cannot imagine the horror. You know, we've heard this story so many times, and it seems like kind of a cute story, kind of a fun story. But think of it in the real way. Think of it as if you were to fall into a lake or the ocean, and you're going down, and you're starting to drown. You're maybe holding your breath, but you realize in a few seconds you have to let go. And suddenly this great fish comes along, and I'm not sure if he saw it right away, but all of a sudden he's inside of it. And obviously there is enough air pocket in there for him to breathe for several days. He's going to be there for 3 days. And so probably something more like a whale, something where there's going to be air inside. There's going to be a place for him to breathe, and that's where he is. And Jonah was inside the fish, it says, for 3 days and 3 nights. I mean, this must have been incredible. I'd love to hear this fish story, but that's further down the road. Jonah's in the whale, and the fish, or wherever he's in. And at the end of those 3 days, he comes to his senses. I guess he comes to the point where he realizes, okay, something's got to change here. I mean, I can't just stay here. I'm sure the acid from the animal itself is eating away at him, and who knows how much he deteriorated. But God is sustaining him, and he comes to the point where he himself has a change of heart, somewhat, at least to doing what God has asked him to do. And so he says a prayer. He says, I cried out to the Lord in my great trouble. Oh, man, you're in trouble, Jonah. And I love the next sentence. And he answered me. I cried out. This is how Jonah came to the Lord. He was crying out. It wasn't a simple, nice little prayer. He was crying out. He was desperate. In his great trouble, he cried out. And this is where God answers. This is what God is waiting for. A broken and contrite heart he will not despise. I called out to you from the land of the dead. I mean, he saw himself. He was dying. He knew he was going to die in this situation. There was no escape from this unless God himself could save him. And Lord, you heard me. As my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord. As my life was slipping away, he was slowly dying. He could feel it. He could feel something wasn't right. I remembered the Lord, and in my earnest, I prayed. My prayer went out to you, to your holy temple. I was so desperate. There's something about being in that place where we really get to the point where we have nothing but God. God, this is where God often acts. Then he says in his prayer, those who worship false gods, those who worship idols, those who rely on other religions, those who rely on your self-serving psychologies out there, who somehow you think you can just pull up your own bootstraps and just do your own thing. Those who worship false gods, other supports, other ways of dealing with life, they turn their backs on all of God's mercies. You see, God is ready to work, but when you don't go to him, when you don't come to him and say, Lord, I need you, which he wants you to do, you turn your back on what God could do. Then verse 9, but I will offer sacrifices to you. I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise, and I will fulfill all my vows. God, I will do what you've asked. I will do what I've promised to do. I am your prophet. I will go and I will speak to Nineveh. For my salvation comes from the Lord alone. And so Jonah goes. He gets a second chance. Here's a very reluctant missionary, a very reluctant prophet of God. Nothing really here to brag about in terms of Jonah. But Jonah does go. And God still loves him. God still delivers him. God still uses him. God gives Jonah a second chance, as he will to the people of Nineveh as well. Chapter 3 says, on the day Jonah entered the city. On the day he entered the city. I mean, that must have been quite the journey. You know, to get spit out of the fish onto the shore after spending 3 days and 3 nights there. Then he's got to travel probably about 300, 400, 500 miles to Nineveh. Probably would take him quite a while to get there. And he enters the city, and he has one message. He says, 40 days, in about 40 days, a little less than a month and a half, from now, Nineveh will be destroyed. Now, he has gone to the center of the city. It's been about across Nineveh is about a 3-day journey, so about a day and a half in to the center of the city. And he starts to preach in the middle of the city square. And I'm sure, I'm thinking here in my own mind, if that was me, I mean, the fear of walking through such a city, I'm sure they would recognize him as some kind of foreigner, and maybe they would know that he's somewhat of an Israelite. Maybe, he must have been dressed kind of poorly. He probably stunk still like fish. Who knows how people saw him? But he gets to the center and he says these words, 40 days from now, Nineveh will be destroyed. And the next sentence is amazing. Obviously, they were ready for this. It says, the people of Nineveh believed God's message. Why? Why would they have believed that message? Who is this guy to come here and tell us in 40 days you're going to be destroyed? Unless God had been working in their hearts already. God has a way of working in the hearts of people, and he knows he sent Jonah to them because he knew the hearts of these people. He had, God being God knows everyone's hearts and minds and thoughts. Would have known as he searches to and fro throughout the earth, looking for those of faith, he would have understood, they would have believed. So the people of Nineveh believed God's message. And from the greatest So from the kings, the leaders, to the least, to the children, to those who are maybe on the outcast, I don't know, the lame, those with leprosy, to the very least, they all declared a fast. They would stop eating and they put on burlap to show their sorrow. They repented of their whole life. They realized they were in a very serious place with God, and they repented and turned to God, because Jonah had come to say, your days are numbered. It is coming to an end. Incredible. Incredible. And verse 10 says that when God saw what they had done and how they had put a stop to their evil ways, they had stopped their evil ways, he changed his mind and did not carry out the destruction he had threatened. God was being merciful. God, who could have easily done this, had destroyed the city without even warning. That's not who God is. I truly believe that one day when we get to heaven and we understand more completely what it really means to be loved by Christ, what it really means to understand what he did in giving himself on the cross, and this extreme, reckless love for us, who were his enemies, who didn't want him, we as a world, we're going to understand the incredible love he has, and mercy being that he has the right to punish and to destroy, and he holds back, and grace, meaning that he gives to those who do not deserve. We're going to be blown away by God. In Revelation, it describes those who are at the judgment seat, or in Matthew 24 as well, those who are separated from God for eternity. We would call it hell. The Bible calls it hell, a separation from God forever. Part of what happens in hell is that there's mourning, and I've always thought that curious. There is, obviously, it's going to be a horrific place, but I think what's going to be really horrible to hear, or horrible that's going to be experienced, is that people are going to be mourning. And I'm thinking, why are they crying? Why is there such mourning? And I think part of it, at least, is because they're going to realize that they were duped, that they missed out on this eternally incredible God who is so loving, so caring, and they are mourning over what they've lost. They are mourning what they traded Christ for the short-lived life of their own selfishness and sin. And they're going to mourn. They're going to mourn because of the great loss they have. They traded Christ for something else. So Jonah, as we've read before, he's upset with God. They've repented. God has repented. He's not going to destroy them. He's waiting for the God to destroy them. He waits and waits and waits. And then he complains to God. He says, I knew, God, you would do this. I knew it. I knew you would do this. In chapter 4, God shows his heart. He says, Nineveh has more than 120 people living in spiritual darkness, Jonah. 120,000. 120,000. Living in spiritual darkness. Their spirits are dark. They don't understand truth. They don't see the light of God. Not to mention even the animals, Jonah, which are my creation as well. He's basically what he's saying. Shouldn't I feel sorry for such a great city, Jonah? Jonah, what do you think? 120,000 people. You think I should just easily destroy them? You think I shouldn't feel sorry for such a great city? These are people. These are human beings. You see, Jonah had a great prejudice towards these people. And prejudice is horrible in our world today. It happens today as well. The Lord is saving people from every tribe, every language, every nation, every people, every tongue. To be a Christ follower is not to be a North American, is not to be European. It is a all-encompassing following of Jesus Christ, of whoever believes. And you become part of God's kingdom. No longer part of this dark world kingdom, as Paul describes in Acts. For he has delivered us from that kingdom. And he's put us into the kingdom of his Son, in whom he loves. God says, shouldn't I feel sorry for such a great city? And we look at our lives and we say, are we feeling sorry for those around us who do not know God? The people I work with at school, do I feel sorry for them that they are in spiritual darkness, fearing what's going on in the world today, fearing that there's no hope, fearing that there's no future? Should I not feel for such people? Of course I should. And you find yourself in your life circumstances, and you need to ask the question, do I feel sorry for those who do not follow God, even for those who it seems like they are so far from him? We have no idea how close someone might be. Like these people who, when they heard one message, one sentence, turned, repented, and found new life, and will be, as Jesus said, in heaven one day. Let me finish with Ezekiel chapter 18:23. This is God's heart. This is God's heart towards those who are not believers yet. He says, have I pleasure in the death of the wicked? God is saying, do I find joy when someone who isn't a follower of mine, of my Son, when someone who is living in sin, when they die? Do you think I find pleasure in that? And he says, and would I not rather that they should turn from their way and live? Of course. It's a rhetorical question. God is saying, I would rather that they would turn. I am patient, wanting all to be saved and come to repentance. He doesn't want anyone to perish. And so as we look at this story of Jonah, let us not be reluctant missionaries in our world. And where God gives us opportunity, where God says, say something, pray for boldness. Pray for opportunity to say, Lord, I want to share something with someone. Maybe there's someone ready to believe in you. Give me your heart for them. I want to have the same attitude that maybe they will turn to you and live.